Good morning. Good morning. I hope that you all are doing well. My name is Gerald Gayton. I'm so glad to be with you. This is your first time listening in. Thank you for being with us. And if you're a repeat listener, someone who watches, a repeat viewer rather, we're so happy to have you back with us. We have a lot to talk about today. Talking about and now when we talk about David was a mighty man of God. Tremendous story where his life and the exploits and things that he was able to do in Israel helped him to become really a model king and a very esteemed king. He's in the lineage of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So he was a very important man. And with David, as we look at some of the things that he did, from conquering Goliath to winning so many battles as a mighty man of valor, to really navigating wisely as the king amongst God's people and helping to store away for the temple. He just did so many things in his life. And I began by saying that really he was known as a man that was after God's own heart. And that wasn't something that a title or a wonderful way to describe him that someone else, a person, a human being had ascribed to David. This was something that God himself said about David. So it had to be true. I want to talk about that because one of the things that I found in God, and I'm so grateful for this being the case, is that God allows us to grow and to walk with him. And if you may be familiar with the story of David, and one of the things that comes to mind where he was really off base was with Bathsheba and the killing of her husband Uriah and all of the things that were a part of that. But what we're going to talk about today in 1 Samuel 20, and really I think through the 30th chapter, we're going to kind of hit those things. And for the sake of time, we won't be able to read through everything. So I'll be giving you some summary. But please do yourself a favor. When you have time, read through these scriptures, read through these chapters, and see what the Word of God is saying. So I'm going to begin I'm going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 30. We're going to read some scriptures first, and then we're going to take our time building the context so you can really understand what's happening here. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation. We'll begin at verse 1. It says, 3 days later, when David and his men arrived at home at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They carried off the women and children and everyone else, but without killing anyone. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. David's two wives, Ahinoam and from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those captured. Pay attention to this here. Now, David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Verse 7, then he said to Abiathar the priest, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought it. Then David asked the Lord, should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them? And the Lord told him, yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken for you. So we're going to begin with the end. And now we're going to go back into the chapters and kind of figure out what was going on. So David was in Ziklag. He returned to Ziklag with his men. But now Ziklag is in the land of the Philistines. And David was from Israel. He's a mighty man. He slayed the giant Goliath, who was a Philistine champion. And so what was David and his men and their families doing in Ziklag? So we're going to get back to that. And we're going to learn some very valuable lessons in the course of today. So going back to 1 Samuel chapter 20. Well, actually in verse 20, where, to sum up the key piece that we're going to need for today, David has met with Jonathan. Jonathan says, hey, I don't believe my dad's trying to kill you, even though Saul, the king, the first king of Israel, had tried to kill David on multiple times. He was jealous of David, and Saul had been rejected by God. And whom God had chosen was actually David to replace Saul. And so Saul knew this. And he couldn't contain himself. And at different times, he had tried to kill David by throwing a spear at him and trying to pierce him through the wall, trying to kill him. And so David had this relationship with Saul where he loved him. He began by serving him. But Saul, when he heard the celebration of the women talking about David's exploits, and those exploits being greater than Saul's, jealousy crept in. And my brothers and sisters, this is something that we have to be so careful about, is jealousy. There's no place for jealousy in our lives. That is something that is of the flesh, that is of Satan, and jealousy will rot us from the inside out to the place where we can enjoy or celebrate each other, and it robs us of life. So Saul was eaten up by this jealousy. He couldn't celebrate and everything that David did, even though David was serving him and he was faithful to Saul. Saul couldn't see it in the right light because he was tainted by this jealousy. And that jealousy resulted in Saul treating David and trying to kill David. So this went on for, you'll see this in the first or several chapters prior to 1 Samuel chapter 20. And so we come to a threshold where Jonathan, the son of Saul, who David and Jonathan were knit together. They loved each other. They were brothers indeed. And how good it is to have fellowship amongst brothers and sisters where we have real family. And Jonathan had this with David. And so he goes to David and says, listen, my dad, I don't think he's trying to kill you. I think he's past that. But if I find out that's true, I'm going to let you know. And so he does. David, at the end of this chapter, is now leaving Israel, knowing that Saul has tried to kill him multiple times. He's trying to get out of Dodge. So we're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 21. Read a couple of passages here because it's very important. Starting at verse 1. And David went to the town of Nob to see Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he saw him. He said to David, why are you alone? He asked. Why is no one with you? The king sent me on a private matter, David said. He told me not to tell anyone why I am here. I have told my men we're to meet me later. So David was a mighty king. He was really a mighty man of God. He was a captain in Saul's army, a mighty warrior. And so when Ahimelech saw this, now wherever David went, David rode deep. He had his men with him. Again, he was a man of great status. He was a warrior. So there were some people who would have loved to have do David harm. So when David shows up to the priest without that entourage, Ahimelech he's like, what is going on here? Again, to get the context here, David is running from Saul for his life. He goes to the priest. He left. He doesn't have any bread, anything with him. When the priest asks him, why are you here, David, by yourself? David tells him, oh yeah, I'm on the king's business. And since David was always doing things for the king, Ahimelech had no reason to doubt him. He took him at his word. And now, verse 7. Now Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief's herdsman, was there that day, having been detained before the Lord. And David asked Ahimelech, do you have a sword or a spear? The king's business was so urgent that I didn't even have time to grab a weapon. Ahimelech says, I only have the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah. The priest replied, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Take that if you want it, for there is nothing else here. There is nothing like it. David replied, give it to me. So again, we see this interaction. David comes and he starts telling lies. That's really what it is. He was not on business from the king. He told Ahimelech that. He didn't leave so urgently to do the matter from the king and that he forgot his weapons. He was running. And so he tells these lies to Ahimelech the priest, who has no reason to doubt him. And while this exchange is happening, there happens to be a guy, Doeg the Edomite, who's going to show back up later, who was detained before the Lord. So the story goes on, and David leaves, and he goes of all places, verse 10. So David escaped from Saul and went to King Achish of Gath. Now, Gath was the place where Goliath, that was his hometown. So David, the one who had slain the captain of the Philistines, the Philistine champion, now running from Saul, runs to the very place that's the hometown of the man that he killed and that was celebrated. So he's in a bad place. And saints, this is so true. I don't know if you've ever been there. I certainly have, where maybe things have not gone the way you thought they would go. And David, much like ourselves, received a promise from God, said, hey, here's what your life is going to be. You're going to be the next king. I'm with you. And then throughout this situation, David is facing challenge after challenge coming from God's man, the man who was anointed by God, who has been rejected by God. But because of his position, the king, he treated him a certain way. He would not raise his hand to him as being God's anointed, regardless of what that man did. And I think that this is, although this is not part of what we're going to talk about today, it's important to know that there's a proper way to deal with people in the Lord and leadership and elders. There's specific ways. The scripture deals with that. Now, we shouldn't rebuke an elder, right? And treat them as a father. And that doesn't mean that people are always right. The Bible declares it this way, that all authority is from God, right? So that's God ordained. The way we deal with authority must be in recognition of that fact as unto the Lord. Not necessarily because authority is always right. That clearly is not the case. But even when they're not right, we have an obligation to respond in a right way and let the Lord deal with it, or make sure that we are dealing with it in a way that is proper as unto him. David understood that. He had walked it out, but he wasn't getting the results that he thought he should get. And again, maybe you've been there, I've been there, where I thought I was doing it the right God's way, and the results I was getting didn't look anything like what I was expecting. And so in that moment, much like ourselves, or I won't put it on you, but certainly it's been me, I've done this in the past to my shame, is that when it hadn't worked out the way I thought God was doing it, then I figure I will do it my way. And David does that here. And as he does it, he runs to the hometown of Goliath before the leader there, King Achish. And when he's now deep in the enemy's territory before the king who, Goliath was his champion. And David realizes, comes to himself, trying to run from one situation, fixing it himself. He goes into a worse situation and he begins to act crazy. And he begins to act crazy and let drool run down on his beard and all of these sorts of things. And King Achish says, man, away with this guy. Yeah, I don't need to have another crazy man in my temple. Get rid of, or my camp, get rid of this guy. And David was delivered. So then David goes to a cave and all these men begin to come to him. And we're picking it up in 1 Samuel chapter 22 now. Now, I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to read through this, but really this is coming from chapter 6. I'll give you a summary rather, as opposed to reading through that. And verse 6 and up, down through probably right around verse 20, where Saul is complaining to his men, like, who amongst you is for David? And after all of this, a person speaks up by the name of no one other than Doeg, the Edomite. And so Doeg says, I saw David and Ahimelech, the priest. He gave him food and he gave him a weapon and he sought God on David's behalf. And Saul in his fury says, bring Ahimelech, not by himself, the priest of God, but all of his family, all of his relatives, bring them all and come before me. And Saul questions Ahimelech. And he says, why did you help my enemy? I think about this. Ahimelech, the priest, who had no reason to doubt what David was saying to him, said in his innocency, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. This is what he told me, and I responded to him in kind. I'm innocent in this. Saul, in his rage, says, kill not only Ahimelech, but kill all of their family. And the men wouldn't put their hands to him because they were the priests of God. But old Doeg the Edomite began to lay waste to the priests and to their families, to only one man named Abiathar was left. So he escapes to David and tells David what happens. Now you got to imagine how David felt, because David was trying to handle things in his own strength. He escaped on the run, tells a lie. The priest believes him. The payout of David's lie to the priest and his family is they were all murdered, except one man, Abiathar. And he comes to David and relays this information to him. So David is beginning to see, whoa, the weight of trying to figure things out in our own strength and in our own wisdom. He gets all the priest and his family killed. He winds up in a place that is the hometown of the champion he killed. He escapes by the skin of his teeth by acting like a crazy man. So you can see him going from situation to situation to situation. Through the span of time, and for the sake of time, I'm going to speed up just a little bit. You'll see in chapter 24 that David is now being chased by Saul. And Saul gets hold of David, or they surround David, and nature calls. Saul has to go use the restroom, and David and some of his men happen to be lined against the cave where Saul was using the bathroom and didn't see it. David cuts off the corner of his robe, and Saul leaves never the wiser, not knowing that his life was in danger. And when Saul leaves the cave, David reveals himself and lets him know, King, why are you searching for me? I'm not out to harm you. Here's proof. I could have killed you. And Saul looks down at his robe and he sees that it's missing a piece, and David has it in his hand. And so Saul repents and says, oh, David, I'm sorry. You're just, man, and so on and so forth. I'll leave you alone. And he does for a moment. And in the process of time, Saul is stirred up again, and he wants to come after David. He wants to kill him. And so he's chasing David. And you'll begin to see in chapter 26 where Saul is again surrounding, coming after David. A deep sleep comes on the camp in Saul. And David and one of his men go into the camp. They take Saul's spear and his water jug, and they go back into David's camp. David calls out and says, Saul, look, I've got your stuff. I'm just paraphrasing it very quickly. And the man who was supposed to keep you didn't do that. If I wanted to kill you, I could have done it. But I didn't. And so Saul does what has now become a consistent refrain. David, I'm sorry. You're right. You'll be the king. I won't come after you anymore. And you know what? Although David had been through this before, and he had responded the right way, that instance was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because you see David, not perfect, but trying to do the right thing, not willing to harm Saul because he was God's anointed. Chapter 27. And here's what David says in verse 1. But David kept thinking to himself, someday Saul is going to get me. And the best thing I can do is escape to the Philistines. Then Saul will stop hunting for me in Israelite territory, and I will finally be safe. So verse 2, so David took his 600 men, went over and joined Achish, son of Maoch, the king of Gath, back to Achish, Goliath's hometown. And so David came to the place where he said, you know what? I've tried it God's way. This is not going to end. I must fix this. And so his reason took him to a place that worked on one side. He said, Saul won't follow me here. But on the flip side, he's now in the enemy's camp with his family, with his men, with all of their men, deep in the enemy's camp. And it's here in verse 6 where, or verse 5 and 6, where David says, listen, King Achish, don't let us stay in the royal city. We don't deserve to be here. Send us elsewhere. And he gives him none other than Ziklag, which was deeper in Philistine territory. So you got to imagine this. David, in his mind and his strength and his reason, he solves one problem, but he causes much deeper problems. He now is residing in the enemy's camp, deep in their camp, surrounded by the enemy with everything that he owns in his families and their families. And so now he's got to figure out, how does he live in this situation? And maybe you can relate to that, where I've been there, where trying to do things on my own strength and on my own way, and maybe it was from disappointment, regardless of what it was. The conclusion was, I will figure this out. And David is there. And David solves that problem but causes another. And so he decides that, you know what? Here's what I'm going to do. Men, I got a great plan. We got to produce. We're in the enemy's camp here. What we're going to do is this. We're going to fight against and go out and raid the enemies of Israel. We're going to kill them all, so no one's there. We'll bring back the goods. We'll make some money. We'll break off King Achish with a little bit, so he's happy that we're here. And I'm going to tell him that we're raiding the enemies of the Philistines, which would be Israel and others. But in reality, he was killing the enemies of Israel. Killing everybody. Tearing up everything. Everybody was dead, so that no one would be able to tell the story. And these men were doing this with David for a year and 4 months. In Ziklag, killing the enemies of Israel, lying to Achish, saying, we're killing your enemies. And it worked beautifully. Until one day, chapter 28, Achish, taking David at his word, says, hey, we're going to fight against your master Saul. You know, the one that hates you so much that you've been raiding and all of these things. David, we're going to fight against him, and I want you next to me. David doesn't shrink from this. You got to imagine this. He's going to have to fight, and his men are now going to have to fight against their cousins, their brothers, their uncles. And they're doing this because David had the bright idea to bring his men to the land of the Philistines so that he could be protected by Saul, because he didn't want to do it God's way any further. And so the story goes, and again, time won't allow me to give you justice here, so read it. But the story goes that Achish brings David to the very battlefield where he's turned away because the other kings of the Philistines, there were 5 at a time. And so the other 4 said, are you crazy, Achish? Get rid of David, man. This guy is going to be a liability to us. And so he does it. And as he and his men are leaving the battlefield, headed back to Ziklag, 3 days journey, they've got to be crestfallen. They know that their family, their relatives are going to be slaughtered by the Philistines, and they can't help. And so I know that they had to be walking with heavy hearts, and they're getting to a place where they're 2 days, 3 days later, in the distance, Ziklag is on the horizon. And as opposed to being able to be comforted by their wives and their children, and just a really rough time, and being able to get some solace there, instead of a beautiful city, they see smoke. And as they get closer to that city, they find the unimaginable. And that is that the city has been burnt, everything has been taken, their families are nowhere to be found. And they got to be thinking, when this happens, that this is precisely what they've been doing to all these other nations. But they killed everybody. And so when the scripture tells us in First Samuel chapter 30, verse 1, actually we're going to break down where we go back to verse 6. David was in great danger because his men were very bitter. They were wanting to kill him because they had been following David's lead. And it was a wrong lead. He was operating out of his own strength, out of his own wisdom. And when that happens, especially leaders, hear me, we can cause great harm to not only ourselves, but those around us. And so those men wanted to kill him rightfully. And it was there that David did something that he hadn't been doing all this time. And that is, David turned himself back to the Lord. And David sought the Lord. And when David, all these other things you've seen, I've given you the summary, David was figuring it out. He's saying, here, I'm going to do this. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to move here. I'm going to do this as a plan. All of that came to a head and came crumbling down. But it was when David finally turned back to God and said, he turned to the Lord, encouraged himself in the Lord, and sought the Lord. That is when the Lord didn't reject him and send him out and saying, hey, you didn't listen to me, now you got a calamity, I'm not listening to you. No, he was gracious. He answered him and he dealt with them. And David was able to recover all. So I told you all of that to really come to this piece. Brothers and sisters, trust God to do what he said he would do. Trust God and let's not lean to our own understanding. Let's not try to figure things out in a way that is contrary to what God intends. Let's trust and lean on the Lord. He will be faithful. And when things don't look the way that we would expect them to be, that's okay. Stay faithful to the Lord. Let's entrust and invest ourselves in what he has for us. And I will tell you this, if and when we do that, regardless of whether we've done everything right or wrong, as you can see, as David did, when we will come to ourselves and turn ourselves to our merciful God, turn from our wicked ways and seek his face, God is faithful and just to hear us. I say to you, you may be in a situation like David was. You may have made some wrong choices. You may have turned left when you should have turned right. You're not in bad company. I certainly have been with you. But I can also testify, just like David did, that if and when you turn to the Lord, he will be faithful to forgive you and to give you the answer to what you need because he loves you. And my brothers and sisters, I tell you this, when we do that, we'll be able to celebrate as you read through this next couple of chapters up through the 2nd Samuel. After this victory, David was shortly installed as king. So what God was telling him would happen all this time did happen, just as God said, despite all of David's missteps. God is the only one that can cause everything to work together for good for those that are called by him and that love him. Okay? So, my brothers and sisters, be encouraged. Turn to God. You'll find rest, you'll find grace, and you'll find the answer. Be blessed. Have a good one.